On the night of June 5th, 1944, a paratrooper of the American 82nd Airborne lay flat in a Norman hedgerow, and 3 meters from his face, in absolute darkness, a small light came on. It was not a flare. It was not a muzzle flash. It was a thin, hooded, downward pointing glow, the kind a man makes when he cups his hand around a lens because he needs to see something small and he needs to see it precisely. The paratrooper did not move. He did not call out. He did not reach for a grenade. He did exactly one thing, the single thing that hours of briefings had drilled into him harder than how to fold a parachute, harder than how to find his rally point, harder than how to survive. He found the light, he aimed at the man behind it, and he fired first. Here's the strange part. That man was not holding a rifle. He was not manning a machine gun. He was not an officer waving his unit forward. By every rule of combat the young American had ever been taught, he had just made the most dangerous target on a battlefield, a man whose only weapon in that instant was a flashlight. And the order he had been given was not subtle. It was not find cover and observe. It was not assess and report. It was the bluntest instruction in the entire airborne playbook. The man with the light dies before anyone else. You see the glow, you shoot him, and you shoot him before you shoot the soldier standing next to him with an actual gun. Think about how backwards that sounds. On a field, crawling with snipers, with machine gun nests sighted down every lane, with officers whose death could unravel a whole company, American paratroopers were told that the single most lethal human being in front of them was the one quietly kneeling in a ditch with a covered light. Not the man who could kill you, the man who could kill the hundreds who had not landed yet. Because that is what the light meant. The light meant work. The light meant a specialist in the dark, doing something with his hands that took training most soldiers never received, and patience most soldiers never needed. The light meant that the ground the Americans were about to pour men and gliders and jeeps onto was being turned quietly, methodically, into something that would tear them apart before a single German rifleman ever pulled a trigger. This is the story of that man, the one the German army considered a master of his craft, the product of an engineering culture so confident in its own precision that it believed it could make open farmland impassable with nothing but steel, chemistry, and a few hours of darkness. It is the story of why the United States Army looked at that master, understood exactly how dangerous he was, and then answered him not with a better master of its own, but with something the German system never saw coming. And it is the story of why, in the end, the most feared specialist in the German order of battle was undone by an American answer so simple, so cheap, and so endlessly repeatable that it made all of his expensive brilliance worthless. To understand the order shoot him first, you have to understand what the man with the light could actually do. A single German engineer, given one night and a stretch of field, could do more damage to an Allied landing than an entire infantry platoon. He did not need to fire a shot. He needed only to place his devices in the dark, arm them with hands that knew exactly where the pressure had to go and exactly how much was too much, and then disappear before dawn. By the time the gliders came down at first light, loaded with men and equipment and the heavy weapons the paratroopers desperately needed, the field that looked empty and safe from the air would already be waiting for them. Not with bullets, with something patient, something that did not care whether you were brave. And the light was the tell, because that work, the arming, the placing, the careful setting of a fuse in pitch black, could not be done blind. Sooner or later, the specialist needed to see what his fingers were doing, and for a few seconds, he would risk a hooded glow against his own hands. The Germans knew this was a risk. They trained to keep the light small, shielded, brief. But a risk it remained, and the Americans built an entire reflex around it. The glow was the one moment the invisible man became visible. The 1 second the most dangerous person on the field told you exactly where he was. So the briefing officers made it simple. They did not explain fuse mechanisms to 19-year-olds about to jump into the dark. They gave them a rule a frightened man could remember while falling out of the sky. If you see a light moving low to the ground where no light should be, that is not a lost soldier. That is a man building the thing that kills your friends. You do not wait. You do not warn him. You shoot him first. But who was he exactly? This guy with the flashlight. And what was he actually building in the dark that made him worth killing before the man holding the gun? In 1935, in a quiet factory in Munich that until recently had built switchgear and heating systems for railways, a company called Schaltbau began producing something that had nothing to do with trains. It was a steel cylinder about 13 centimeters tall, about 10 centimeters across, light enough for one man to carry several at a time. It looked like a food tin. It was, in fact, one of the most carefully engineered killing devices of the entire war, and the man who placed it in the dark was the reason an American paratrooper was told to shoot the flashlight before the rifle. The device had a name that told you exactly what the German engineers were proud of. They called it the Shrapnel Mine 35, the S-Mine. To the Americans who would later meet it in the hedgerows of Normandy, it had a different name, one spoken with a kind of horrified respect. They called it the Bouncing Betty. Here is what made it brilliant, and here is what made the man who armed it so dangerous. Most landmines of the era were simple. You stepped on them, they exploded under your foot, and if you were unlucky, you lost a leg. Terrible, but survivable, and limited to the one man who triggered it. The German engineers looked at that and decided it was not efficient enough. They did not want to wound one man at ankle height. They wanted to kill everyone standing near him. So they built a mine in 2 stages. When a boot pressed on the 3-pronged igniter at the top, or when a foot caught one of the tripwires strung between the prongs, the device did not explode. It waited. For roughly 4 seconds, nothing happened. And in that pause, a soldier might believe he had stepped on a dud and felt a flush of relief. Then a black powder charge in the base fired, and the inner cylinder leapt out of its canister and rose to about waist height. And there, a meter off the ground, the main charge detonated, throwing roughly 350 steel balls outward in every direction at once. The effective radius was counted not in feet, but in yards. One device, properly placed, could cut down everyone in a circle wide enough to swallow an entire squad. That 4-second delay was not a flaw. It was the whole point. The Germans understood that men move in groups, and that a mine which explodes at the ground only kills the careless individual who steps on it. A mine that jumps to waist height and explodes among the men who came running, or among the men walking close behind, kills the group. The engineering was not about destruction. It was about geometry, about using one device to take the largest possible number of human beings out of a field. Now hold that device in your mind, because the mine itself was only as dangerous as the man who placed it, and placing it was the hard part. The S-mine was buried just beneath the surface, with only the 3 small prongs left showing above the soil, barely visible even in daylight. Setting it required precision. The igniter had to be armed. The safety pin had to come out at exactly the right moment, because the device that was harmless with the pin in became instantly lethal the moment it was gone. Tripwires, if used, had to be strung taut and low and invisible, and often the S mine was not placed alone. The Germans combined them with anti-tank mines, the teller mines, so that a man trying to clear the heavy mine in the dark might disturb the small one beside it and be killed for his trouble. They booby-trapped their own minefields against the people who would come to clear them. This is work that cannot be done by a frightened conscript fumbling in the dark. It is work for a trained engineer, a pioneer, a specialist who knew these devices the way a watchmaker knows a movement and could arm an igniter by feel. Germany did not have an endless supply of such men. Each one represented months of training and years of accumulated craft, and each one, working through the night before an expected assault, could turn an ordinary field into a killing ground. And here is the detail that closes the circle. All of that careful work, the arming, the placing of the pin, the setting of the tripwire, the marrying of the small mine to the large one, had to be done in darkness, because doing it in daylight under observation was suicide. But darkness has a price. A man cannot set a fuse he cannot see. Sooner or later, his fingers working on something that would kill him instantly if he got it wrong, the specialist needed light. A small one, a hooded one, pointed down at his own hands for only a few seconds. He knew it was a risk. His training told him to keep it brief and shielded. But the work demanded it, and so the light came on. Germany had built, by the end of the war, more than 1.9 million S-mines. Schaltbau in Munich made them. Firms like Richard Rinker in Menden made the fuses. An entire industrial pipeline existed to put these devices in the ground across occupied Europe, and especially along the coast of Normandy, where hundreds of thousands of them waited behind the beaches. But a mine in a crate is harmless. It only becomes deadly when a trained man arms it in the dark, which raises the question the paratroopers' order was really built to answer. Why kill that one man with his little light before the soldier standing beside him holding an actual gun? A rifleman can kill you. A machine gunner can kill the men beside you. But the guy with the flashlight can kill the men who have not landed yet. That sentence is the entire logic of the order. And once you see it, the order stops sounding strange and starts sounding like the coldest arithmetic of the war. Start with what an ordinary German soldier could do to an American paratrooper in the dark fields of Normandy. He could shoot at him. If he was good, he hit him. If he was very good, he killed him and maybe one or two others before the Americans located the muzzle flash and killed him back. That is the exchange rate of a firefight. One trained man, firing a weapon, threatens the handful of men directly in front of him for as long as he stays alive. Kill him, and the threat ends with him. Now look at the man with the light. He is not firing at anyone. He is kneeling in a field, in the dark, arming devices and wiring obstacles, and he is not trying to kill the paratrooper crouched in the hedgerow watching him. He does not even know that man is there. He is preparing the field for the people who will arrive at dawn. And here is the part that turns the engineering of the last chapter into life and death. The Germans did not just scatter mines and hope. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had personally ordered a specific defense against airborne landings, wooden poles, 4 to 5 meters tall, driven into every open field that a glider might use. The troops called them Rommel's Pargel, Rommel's asparagus. More than 1 million of them went into the ground across northern France. But Rommel was emphatic on one point, and his own inspection report spelled it out. The stakes alone, he wrote, do not make the obstacle complete. The stakes had to be wired together, and shells and mines had to be attached to them. Read that again, because that is the whole story. The poles by themselves just damaged gliders. The poles, wired with shells and mines, turned an entire field into a single connected trap, where a glider clipping one pole could set off charges strung between all of them. And the man who did that wiring, who connected the explosives, who armed the fuses that married the obstacles into one killing system, was the specialist in the dark with the light. His work was the difference between a field that wrecked a glider and a field that detonated underneath it. Now, do the math the briefing officers were really doing. Those open fields were not empty targets. They were landing zones. On D-Day, wave after wave of gliders came down behind Utah Beach, and the reinforcement lifts arrived in the evening, around 9 o'clock at night, gliders packed with infantry and with the heavy equipment the lightly armed paratroopers desperately needed. A single American glider carried 13 men, or 4 men and a jeep, or a howitzer, or an anti-tank gun, or thousands of pounds of ammunition and medical supplies. These were not powered aircraft that could pull up and go around. They were one-way plywood boxes committed to whatever field lay in front of them, coming in blind in the dark. So picture the two outcomes side by side. Outcome one, the paratrooper hesitates, the specialist finishes his work, and at dawn, a glider full of 13 men comes down into a field wired into a single explosive trap. The glider hits a pole, the charges fire, and an entire load of men and equipment is gone in an instant, killed not by a soldier, but by an arrangement set in the dark hours earlier. Outcome two, the paratrooper sees the light, fires, and the specialist falls before he finishes connecting the field. The poles stay just poles. The glider that comes down at dawn crashes hard. Men are hurt, but the load survives. That is the arithmetic. One bullet fired at one man with a flashlight at the right second could save an entire glider load. One moment of hesitation could cost all of them. No rifleman on that field offered a trade like that. No machine gunner did. The man with the light was the only target whose death paid out not in ones and twos, but an entire aircraft full of men. And the same logic ran toward the roads. A specialist working at a bridge or a crossroads in the dark was not threatening the men in front of him either. He was setting a charge for the column of reinforcements that would come up that road in the morning. Kill him, and the road stayed open. Let him finish, and the road became a grave for whoever used it next. This is why the instruction could not wait for caution. There was no time to challenge him, no time to call it in, no time to be sure. The work he was doing was invisible in its effect and only briefly visible in its execution, in that one hooded glow against his hands. The light was the single instant the most dangerous man on the field revealed himself, and it was also the last instant before his work was done. Hesitate, and you lost both the man and everyone his work would kill. So the order made brutal, perfect sense. See the light, and you are not looking at a soldier. You are looking at the one man on the field whose hands are still moving, still connecting, still arming the thing that kills the people who have not arrived yet. You do not warn him. You do not wait. You shoot him first, but knowing to shoot one man in the dark does not clear a field of 1,000,000 mines. And that is where the Americans did something the German specialist never saw coming. Here is the question the German specialist never thought to ask, because his entire culture had trained him not to. What happens to a master craftsman when the enemy decides it does not need to be as good as him, only good enough, and 100,000 times over? The German system was built on the individual. The specialist in the dark was the product of long training and accumulated craft. A man who could arm a fuse by feel and wire a field into a single trap. Germany was proud of him. The Wehrmacht's defensive doctrine assumed that quality of this kind, concentrated in skilled hands, would make ground impassable. And it worked, as long as the enemy played the same game and tried to answer one master with a better master of his own. The Americans refused to play that game. They looked at the problem and made a decision that ran against every instinct the German engineer respected. They did not try to grow a clearance specialist as skilled as the man who laid the mines. They decided instead to make the skill unnecessary, to take the one thing the German system depended on, rare expertise, and replace it with the one thing American industry produced better than anyone on earth: volume, standardization. A process so simple it could be taught to an ordinary draftee in a few weeks and then repeated identically by tens of thousands of them across an entire front. The clearest symbol of that decision was a device, and the honest history of it is worth telling exactly right, because it does not start in America. The first practical portable mine detector was invented by a Polish officer, Lieutenant Józef Kosacki, who completed his design in Britain in the winter of 1941 and 42 after fleeing the fall of Poland and then the fall of France. He never patented it. He gave it to the British Army as a gift and received a letter of thanks from the king. The idea, the breakthrough, the principle that a hum in a telegraph amplifier could betray buried metal belonged to an Allied inventor, not an American one. What the Americans did was take that principle and do to it what they did to everything. They turned it into a standardized, mass-produced instrument and put it in the hands of an entire army. The U.S. version was designated the SCR-625. It was standardized and pushed into production by the Army Services of Supply in September of 1942, and it was already in the hands of American units landing in Morocco that November. A 6-foot rod, a flat search coil under a wooden disc, a battery pack in a canvas bag, earphones, and a low hum that rose when the coil passed over metal. The whole set weighed about 7.5 pounds. It found metallic mines 6 to 12 inches down. It was not perfect. It did not need to be. It needed to exist by the thousand and work in the hands of a frightened 19-year-old, and it did. That is the contrast in a single object. The German master needed a light and a lifetime of training to arm one field in the dark. The American answer needed a canvas bag, a hum in a pair of earphones, and an afternoon of instruction to clear it. But the detector is only half the story, and not even the most important half. The deeper American weapon was not the machine. It was the method, and the school that stamped it into men by the thousand. American combat engineers were trained at Fort Belvoir in Virginia, the home of the Army's engineer school, and the training was deliberately, almost stubbornly, unglamorous. A new engineer learned to dig, to string wire, to recognize explosives by sight, and to clear mines using a procedure that any farm boy or factory worker could absorb. And when the detectors failed, when the ground was too cluttered with metal scrap, or the mines had too little metal to register, the engineers fell back on a method so primitive it sounds like a joke until you understand its genius. They got down on their stomachs and probed the soil ahead of them, inch by inch, with a bayonet, feeling for the side of a buried mine. Probing with a bayonet was the old reliable method, the one engineer battalions came back to after every clever alternative failed. And that is precisely the point. It required no rare talent. It required patience, discipline, and a procedure followed identically by every man in the line. One engineer on his belly with a bayonet, clearing a path, with the tanks and infantry inching forward behind him. The famous image of the war was not a genius. It was an ordinary soldier doing a simple thing correctly, in a long line of other ordinary soldiers doing the same simple thing. This was the asymmetry the German system could not survive. Germany had bet on the irreplaceable man, and the irreplaceable man is, by definition, scarce. Kill him, and the skill dies with him, and there are only so many like him to begin with. America had bet on the replaceable process, and a process does not die. Lose one engineer probing with a bayonet, and another takes his place the next morning, trained to the same standard, carrying the same detector, following the same steps. You cannot win a war of attrition against a method. You can only lose it slowly. The German specialist in the dark was the finest individual answer to the problem of stopping an army. The Americans did not build a finer individual. They built a system that did not need one, produced it by the thousand, and taught it to anyone. And against 100,000 good enough men, the one master with the flashlight was about to discover exactly how little his mastery was worth. By the spring of 1945, the German specialist in the dark had not lost his skill. His hands were as steady as ever. He could still arm a fuse by feel, still wire a field into a single trap, still do the work that no ordinary soldier could do. Nothing about the master had changed. What had changed was the value of being a master, and that change had quietly destroyed the entire system built around him. Think about what Germany had actually wagered. It had bet its defensive doctrine on the irreplaceable man, the soldier whose rare expertise could make ground impassable. It was a sophisticated bet made by a sophisticated army, and on paper, the logic was sound. One brilliant engineer in a field could be worth a company of riflemen. The mines he laid did not sleep, did not tire, and did not need to be fed. For the cost of one trained man and a crate of devices, you could turn a meadow into a wall. But every bet carries a hidden assumption, and the German assumption was that skill was the scarce thing on the battlefield, the thing that decided outcomes. That assumption had been true for most of the history of war. The Americans proved it was no longer true, and they did it not with a better engineer, but with a worse one, multiplied. A 19-year-old with a canvas detector bag and 3 weeks of training at Fort Belvoir was man for man, no match for the German specialist. But there was never just one of him. There were thousands, all trained to the same standard, all following the same procedure, and behind them an industrial machine that could replace any one of them by morning and never run short. That is the moment the master became worthless, and it is worth being precise about why. He was not defeated in a duel. No clever American engineer outwitted him device for device. He was made irrelevant by arithmetic. The German system could field skilled men only in the small numbers that real expertise allows. The American system could field competent men in numbers that expertise has nothing to do with. When good enough is produced by the 100,000 and the irreplaceable is produced by the handful, the contest is over before the first mine is cleared. You cannot outskill a process. You can only be slowly buried by it. The flashlight makes the whole thing concrete. That small hooded light had been, for years, the most dangerous thing an American paratrooper could see in the dark, because behind it was a man whose work could kill people who had not even landed yet. The order to shoot him first was the bluntest possible acknowledgement of how much one master was worth. But notice what that order really was. It was not a better engineer. It was a rule simple enough to give a frightened teenager falling out of the sky. See the light, shoot the man. The answer to the irreplaceable specialist was not another specialist. It was a procedure that anyone could execute, and that is the same answer, in miniature, that won the larger contest. America did not beat the German master at his own craft. It changed the rules so that craft no longer decided the outcome. Now, it is important to be honest about what this story is and what it is not. This is not the claim that mine detectors won the Second World War, or that American engineers mattered more than the men who fought and died on every front. The war was won by an alliance at staggering cost, with the Soviet Union absorbing losses on a scale that dwarfs almost everything else, and the British and other allies carrying burdens of their own from first day to last. The defeat of Germany was the work of many nations and many millions of people, and nothing here diminishes that. This is a narrower story about one specific technical problem and one specific way of solving it. But within that narrow frame, the lesson is real, and it reaches well beyond mines and flashlights. The German engineering culture that produced the man in the dark was genuinely the finest in the world at building the irreplaceable object and the irreplaceable expert. It believed deeply that quality concentrated in skilled hands was the decisive thing. The American answer was a different philosophy entirely. Make it simple enough to teach, make it standard enough to mass produce, make it common enough that losing one costs you nothing, because there are 10,000 more like it. It is less beautiful, less impressive to watch, and in a long war against a system that bet everything on the brilliant individual, it was decisive. That is the quiet devastation underneath the order to shoot the man with the flashlight. The Germans had built a defense around a specialist so skilled that an entire enemy army was taught to fear him personally, to single him out, to kill him before anyone else on the field. By any older logic, that fear was a kind of triumph. But the fear was also the trap, because the Americans answered that one feared master, not by becoming masters themselves, but by building a system that made his mastery beside the point. They produced competence by the thousand, taught it to ordinary men, and replaced every loss before the sun came up. In the end, the man with the flashlight kept his skill to the very last. He simply lived long enough to watch it stop mattering. And that, more than any single weapon, is the story of how the most carefully engineered defense of the war was undone. Not by a better craftsman, but by a country that decided it would rather have 100,000 good enough soldiers than one perfect one, and had the factories to make that choice real. That's all 5 chapters. The script resolves through the fate of the German bet on the irreplaceable specialist, lands the U.S. solved it at scale thesis, and holds the balance on the war's outcome without shortchanging the USSR or the other allies. If you want, I can tighten any chapter, adjust the cold open timing, or do a pass to smooth transitions between chapters for a continuous read.